We'll get started. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a Friday evening for David Kennedy's keynote address for the Wide Open Town Symposium. My name is Diane Muty-Burke, and I am an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for Midwestern Studies at UMKC. And on behalf of my co-organizers, Jason Rowe and John Herron, and the sponsoring institutions, the Center for Midwestern Studies and the Kansas City Public Library, I'd like to briefly tell you how this project came to be, and then to thank all the people and institutions who have made it possible. So the model for this program and the project was a 2011 collaboration between UMKC, KU, and the Kansas City Public Library. This Border Wars project focused on the Civil War in the Kansas-Missouri region and kicked off the Civil War sesquicentennial programming in this area. We invited 15 historians to produce new scholarship, and they presented it at a very well-attended public conference that was held here at the library. The University Press of Kansas ultimately published the scholars' work in a volume called Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri. And many of the scholars went on to contribute essays to the Kansas City Public Library's multiple award-winning Civil War on the Western Border website. So, when the Kansas City Public Library announced that the digital department was starting work on the newest episode in their growing encyclopedia of the history of Kansas City, the Pendergast era, UMKC and the library decided to continue our partnership. We sent out a call for papers nationally and selected 17 scholars who were charged with producing new scholarship on Kansas City during the 1920s and 30s. Now, while these papers do not provide comprehensive coverage of the history of this era, they do represent a broad range of really fascinating topics. We kicked off the symposium earlier today with sessions on politics and the city's diverse communities, and we'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to learn about arts and culture and the economic development of the city, and you are all invited to come. In the coming years, please watch for the launch of the Kansas City Public Library's Pendergast era website, which will host original documents and images, as well as an encyclopedia and scholarly interpretive essays about this time period, and the publication of the volume, which will feature the longer essays from which the symposium talks were drawn. Now, on to the many, many thank yous. There were a myriad of people and institutions that have supported this project with their hard work and their resources. We'd first like to thank Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, which is an organization that supports the many historical and cultural sites that interpret the history of Kansas and Missouri of the border region as it relates to the era of the Civil War and the enduring question of freedom. Tim Ogle, Elizabeth Hobson, and Julie McPike were early supporters of this project, and we very much appreciate their efforts on our behalf. We also received generous funding from the Missouri Humanities Council, an organization that is dedicated to supporting humanities programming in delivered to public audiences in the state of Missouri. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Speaker Program and Annette Winhorn for helping to arrange Dr. Kennedy's lecture this evening. And I'm sure we would all like to thank Tom's Town Distillery, which bills itself, yes, yeah, very nice, as the first legal distillery in Kansas City since before Prohibition, for providing the wonderful refreshments at the reception this evening. Now, a special thanks goes to our wonderful partners at the Kansas City Public Library. Crosby Kemper, Carrie Coogan, and Steve Wolfrock have been tremendously supportive of this project. Eli Paul, David Lacrone, and Brian LeBeau have clocked many hours helping to organize the event. The talented Andy Dandino provided all the wonderful artwork and facilitated the visual aspects of the program. Courtney Lewis and Brittany Rawell managed media relations and public affairs, and Leslie Case and Willie Dilworth have worked very hard to prepare the facilities, and they're running the AV at the Truman Forum tonight so that you can hear everything that's going on. There are also a number of UMKC people who I would like to thank. The UMKC Dean of Arts and Sciences, Wayne Vaught, financially supported this effort through the Bernard and Haskell Lecture Fund, and the High School College Credit Partnership. Thanks also to Carlin Mabane and Cynthia Jones for helping to organize the teacher session that we held at lunchtime this afternoon. Vice Chancellor Lawrence Dreyfus from the UMKC Office of Research Services provided tremendous financial support for the symposium and for the anticipated book project. Thanks to Chelsea Dahlstrom and Karan Hopkins for their help as we worked to raise money for this project. I'd also like to thank my wonderful UMKC colleagues who worked to bring the Center for Midwestern Studies projects to fruition. The mission of the center is threefold. First, to stimulate new scholarship on this compelling region. Second, to get this material into the hands of teachers and students. And third, to develop interesting programming for public audiences. And I think this project engages all three of these missions. So thanks to my colleagues, Chris Cantwell and Amy Brost and John Herron, who work with me at the center, to UMKC graduate students, Matt Reeves and Keenan Brown, who are helping during this symposium. And I want to circle back around to John and Jason. They have been my co-organizers and they are co-editors of this volume. When John is not serving as the chair of the history department, he was helping in very big and small ways with the development of this project. And Jason, whose day job is working on the development of the Kansas City Public Library's digital projects, has invested hundreds of hours into making this project a success. But the biggest thanks goes to Amy Brost, the center's Director of Programming and Development. She has worked tirelessly behind the scenes, writing grants, organizing travel and meals, and generally keeping us all on track. And her contribution to this project cannot be overstated. Now, right now, I'd like to welcome Crosby Kemper to the stage to introduce David Kennedy. My colleagues and I highly value our partnership with Crosby and the Kansas City Public Library. Crosby and his talented staff have transformed the library into a cultural jewel of the city. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for your support for this project.
So Diane, thank you very much, and we value our partnership as well. And any partnership with a history department that, like UMKC's, that also involves a partnership with a distillery and gin and vodka is a great partnership as far as I'm concerned. So thank you so much. I'm going to mention a couple of upcoming programs because I think this is an audience that probably be interested in these upcoming programs, and then I will introduce Professor Kennedy. We do have a mini Renaissance Festival going on at the library on April 12th and April 14th. You know that Union Station is doing the Da Vinci exhibit. I hope you all see that. It's got a little less than a month to go, I think, and just before the bell rings, we're bringing in the leading American historian of the Renaissance, Guido Ruggiero from the University of Miami, and I'll be having a conversation with him about the Renaissance, the current state of scholarship, and some of the great things and great names in the Renaissance. And that's on the 12th at the Central Library. And here at the Plaza on the 14th, Toby Lester will be coming to talk about his book, Da Vinci's Ghost, which is a wonderful book. And it is about the Vitruvian man, the naked man, which many people, Toby Lester included, think is a self-portrait of Leonardo, a naked man with his arms outstretched inside the circle, inside the square, which actually is a kind of culmination of a long history of mathematics, architecture, cosmology in the history of Western civilization. And Toby Lester is a great explicator of that. So that's our mini Ren Fest that I hold out to you. And then I also want to mention, because I think this audience in particular will be interested in this, one of the leading historians of the New Deal and the Fair Deal, one of the best biographers of Harry Truman, Alonzo Hamby of the University of Ohio, a great friend of the Truman Library and of the Kansas City Public Library, will be here with his brand new biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that is on April 21st and will also be here at the Plaza. So a lot to look for. If you're not on our mailing list, please get on our mailing list, get these calendars, and enjoy all our great programming, a lot of which we do with UMKC and other partners. So David Kennedy, is one of the great historians of our time. We're really honored to have him as the keynote for our symposium and for this enterprise that we're embarked on that we hope will produce a book and a great website. When we did this before with the Civil War on the Western Borders with our partners at UMKC, we produced a great book. We produced a website on the library's website that's won every major historical association award. The Western Society of Western Historians, the state and local historians, the Civil War historians, and the Rosenzweig Prize from the American Historical Association. And that's the beginning, we hope, of the creation of a digital encyclopedia of regional history. And what you've seen today and tomorrow, we hear about from Professor Kennedy, is our doing the 20s and 30s in Kansas City, or as I like to say, drugs, sex, and jazz. We hope that you'll engage in this enterprise because it's the 20s and 30s and because there are a lot of people in this community with memories of that time, or who knew people who had great stories to tell. We want to make this interactive as well, and we want to involve you in this. And so it's great that we have David Kennedy here tonight because he is a historian of the people, if you will. His great book on the Depression, Freedom from Fear, demonstrates that. He's the McLaughlin Professor Emeritus at Stanford, the editor and co-author of the many recent generations of the book, The American Pageant, which is probably one of the best known and most widely read American textbooks, American history textbooks. And he currently runs the Center for the Study of the American West at Stanford. His first book, I believe it's his first book, Birth Control in America, about Margaret Sanger, won the Bancroft Prize, which is sort of the historian's ultimate prize. His book over here about America during World War I. These books, by the way, are for sale in the hall, and I believe he's willing to sign them after this is done. Was nominated, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Freedom from Fear, his masterwork, won the Pulitzer Prize. He then went on to edit the Oxford History of America, which this is a part of, and includes a lot of other great books. He's been the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford. So that's his vita, which is pretty impressive. Actually, there's probably no one in the historical profession with a more impressive vita. But what's really fabulous about David Kennedy is the way he writes. He's a master of the push of narrative history. He pushes his narrative into your consciousness, and he does that from the pull of the sources. He's a man who lets historian who lets the characters and the sources tell the story for him, with incredibly wide empathy for the players on both sides of the various issues, and with a telling and signifying, epitomizing anecdote. I'd give you just one example of that, or I'll give you two examples of that. So he's talking about Hoover becoming president, and this book is remarkably empathetic to Herbert Hoover, and he's talking about Hoover actually epitomizing Coolidge and the differences with Coolidge, and he points out that Hoover is a pretty good fly fisherman, and then he says, this is Hoover, says, Mr. Coolidge was a real conservative, probably the equal of Benjamin Harrison. He was a fundamentalist in religion, in the economic and social order, and in fishing, added Hoover, who had a fly fisherman's disdain for Coolidge's artless reliance on worms. That is such a great phrase, the artless reliance on worms. And it does, and actually in this description, there's a little bit of empathy for Coolidge, who after all, is a little bit more like the rest of us in the way he fishes with worms, right? This is what I would call a citizen's history, in that it's about what happens on the ground in the Depression and World War II, as well as what happens inside what we now call the Beltway or the elites or on Wall Street. But it doesn't. But it also does Wall Street and the Supreme Court. And so there's another great story that I want to mention that is typical of David Kennedy's writing. He writes about the court packing episode, where frustrated by the five horsemen of the apocalypse, the conservative members of the Supreme Court who looked like they were going to strike down most of the New Deal programs and had already struck down some of them, the NRA, for instance. And so he came up with a court packing scheme. He was going to add Supreme Court justices. And this was an outrage. And even a lot of his Roosevelt's friends and some of the great liberals and the Nation and the New Republic didn't think this was quite right and opposed him. It was a major political error. But to emphasize just how much of an error it was, he ends his little section on this in the book with some humor, but it epitomizes perhaps the country's reaction, particularly the intellectual elite's reaction to Franklin Roosevelt's court packing scheme. He quotes the New Yorker, and the background of this, of course, is the Supreme Court at exactly this time moves into the new Supreme Court building, the building that we all know from CNN or wherever where they're standing in front of when they do the news stories, the great classical revival temple. And so at the moment that the Supreme Court moves in, he quotes the New Yorker saying, "It's a magnificent structure with big windows to throw the New Deal out of." Empathy, epitomizing anecdotes, and a kind of exaltation of the actions of individual human beings and the events of history are the center of what could be called one of the great citizens' histories of the United States. So it's an honor to have the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian from Stanford, David Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Diane, where are you, for inviting me to be here. Thank you, Mr. Kemper, for that exceptionally generous introduction. I can honestly say that of all the introductions I've ever had, that one was, without qualification, the most recent. So my subject is the Great Depression. The driver who brought me in from the Kansas City airport asked me what I was doing here, and I said I was here to talk about the Great Depression. And he said, "Oh, you mean the big sadness?" I said, no, it's actually an event in economic history from the 1930s. And there was a little bit of silence, and then he said, "Were they using money then?" So we have a certain fundamental knowledge gap here that probably is not present in this room, but certainly was in that taxi. I really didn't know where to begin to address his understanding of what the Great Depression was all about. So my subject is the Depression, but I want to begin with a personal story, something that actually happened to me. It will strike you at first as having no relation whatsoever to the Great Depression, but I'm going to try to convince you that it might. About now 8 or 9 years ago, I do a lot of bicycling, and I was joining a group of roughly 100 or so bicyclists whom I didn't know, essentially. I knew one or two of them. On a ride down the California coast, the Big Sur coast between Carmel and Cambria. If any of you have been the California coast, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's an exceptionally beautiful piece of the whole Pacific coast. And we're all milling around in the parking lot of the motel in the morning, getting organized, ready to get on the road. It's about 6:30, 7 in the morning. It's foggy, as it often is on the coast. And you have to imagine the scene, a bunch of middle-aged people in spandex getting ready to go. And this guy came up to me and he said, it's a ride that these guys had done for years. It was my first time. And he said, "My name's Jack McGlynn, and I'm a lawyer in San Francisco. How about you?" He said, "Well," I said, "my name's David Kennedy, and I teach history up at Stanford University." He said, "Oh, I know all about you guys." Well, this should have put me on my medal, but I was innocent and just trying to make friends. So he said, "You guys, you historians, all you do is you make up these what-if scenarios. What if this had happened? How would history be different? And what if this had not happened? How would the course of events gone differently?" And as you might imagine, I thought that was a pretty reductionist description of my life's work. But not being swift enough to give him an answer on the spot to that or a retort, I said, I was starting to say something. He said, well, I've got one for you. Yeah, I should have seen it coming. He said, what if on November 22nd, 1963, it had been not John F. Kennedy who fell to the assassin's bullet, but Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated on that day, not Kennedy? How would the course of subsequent history have been different? But as you might imagine, I had never thought of that question before, and as I was fumbling to come up with something that might resemble a cogent answer, he said, well, I'll tell you, and again, you should have seen it coming. He said, there's one thing we can say with absolute certainty if it had been Khrushchev and not Kennedy who had died on that day. He said, Aristotle Onassis would never have married Mrs. Khrushchev. All right, well, it's gratifying to me to see that you get the joke. When I tell that story, and the guy actually did say that to me, it turns out I learned later that that particular exchange originated in a conversation between the Australian Premier Gough Whitlam and Mao Zedong. So who would have thought that Mao pulled that on Whitlam? So Mao had a sense of humor that went unrecorded, I guess. But when I tell that story, as I've tried to a couple of times, to my Stanford undergraduate students, the room is silent. They look at me blankly. They don't have a clue what I'm talking about. So it's more proof, in case we needed it, that historical memory is short and humor is generationally specific and conditioned. So you can share that story with others, but if you share it on people under the age of about 40 or so, I predict you're going to get a very blank stare. All right, so we're going to start with probably the single most famous graphic representation of the Depression, which is what happened to the stock markets after the great crash of 1929. But I want to go back to the story about Jack McGlynn and that bike ride, and actually make the point that actually Jack McGlynn, I've since come to know him pretty well, actually, Jack was making a good point about how historians do their business. That whether explicitly or implicitly, I think we often do ask what are called in the trade counterfactual questions. And we're not a laboratory science. We can't put a historical event on the laboratory bench and run it and titrate in this or that factor and see how the equation runs differently, or the reaction runs differently. So we do often ask these kinds of questions. Sometimes we're a little embarrassed by them, and there are irresponsible ways to do it. But here's what I think is a fairly interesting what-if kind of question. What if there had never been a Great Depression? How would the history of this society, and indeed of the world, have been different? What if there had never been a Great Depression? What would be different about our lives today and the lives of the last 3 or 4 generations since the 1930s? Well, I think there are several things we could say with some confidence about that. One is that I would not be standing in front of you as your speaker for biological reasons that I will try to make clear later on in this presentation. Another is that there most likely would not have been an event on the scale and depth and calamitous dimensions that we know as World War II. And thirdly, I think, and quite arguably, and this is going to be much of my argument here this evening, is that there never would have been a New Deal. And without a New Deal, the terms of life for millions of people for the last 3+ generations in this country would look very, very different indeed. And indeed, I'm going to go a little bit further and try to argue toward the end of these remarks that the Depression episode reveals things about the persistent, stubborn character of our constitutional arrangements and our political culture, because those institutions and arrangements and that culture were all severely challenged by the great economic crisis of the 30s in ways that revealed some of its characteristics that maybe aren't so clear on other occasions. So I'm going to pursue a few questions here with you, like why do we call it the Great Depression? I'm going to try to say some things about its human dimensions. And finally, time permitting, I'm going to say some things about how we might think about comparing the Great Depression of the 1930s and the so-called Great Recession of just a few years ago, with the tail end of which perhaps arguably we're still living in. So let's begin with some of the usual facts. So here we have this very graphic representation of what happened in the stock markets after the great crash of 1929. Incidentally, the crash did not cause the depression. It was kind of a signal that the depression was coming, but it certainly wasn't a causative factor in any meaningful way. But you can see here's the high, if I can make this, I can make it work. This is the high point here in 1929, and stocks were valued at what, 381 on the Dow. Think of that. That was real money in those days too. And here it goes down, loses 90% of its value by 1932. So in a 3-year period, roughly, these stock exchanges shed 90% of their value. This chart only takes us up to 1941. We're not back to 1929 valuations yet. Anybody care to guess when the Dow got back to its 1929 valuation level? 1954 is the correct answer. Doctor, give that man a prize. 25 years before the stock exchanges, the stock market reached again its value that it had just before the crash. So that's, again, when we come to the Great Recession, we'll see a very different pattern of activity. This is something that shows the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the course of the entire 20th century. And here's the Great Depression down here. There's that 1929 high, 1932 low. That little thing up there is the Great Recession of the 2000s. So again, at a glance, I think you can tell not only is all the valuation levels higher in nominal dollars, but the degree of loss here is just not comparable at all with what happened here, nor is the duration it took the stock market, the Dow average, to get back to its 2008 levels. We're now well above 2008 levels, just relatively speaking, a few years later. Again, this just shows the same, this is a little more microscopic view of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. We're back at 2008 valuations by 2013, so at the most this last 5 years, actually we're pretty substantially back within a matter of essentially months. So again, both in depth and in duration, there's just no reasonable comparison whatsoever between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. Again, these are just one more, this is again just a little more microscopic look at our more recent stock market gyrations. This is national income, yet another index of just how severe this crisis was. This is the actual cash income that flows into the hands of households, individuals, consumers. National income is cut by more than 50%. Again, nothing comparable to that in the recession of our own time. Let's see, there we go. Domestic product, again, falls by nearly half. And a decade later, more than a decade later, 1940, we're not yet back to 1929 levels of output. So again, a reminder that not only was this a very, very severe shortfall or falling off of income and production, but a decade later, after the onset of the event in 1929, we're still not back to pre-Depression conditions. And indeed, it won't come as any surprise to you to hear that many people in the 1930s believed that they had permanently entered, in the modern economy, the American economy, the world economy, had permanently entered a state of just lower income, lower production, lower valuations. Unemployment, this is production again, just a brief international comparison. The two countries that were most severely affected by the Depression, it turns out, were Germany and the United States. In both of them, the index of industrial production goes down by a significant amount down here. But you'll notice Germany comes pretty steadily back out, not least of all because of military spending. The United States doesn't get back to its baseline here of 1929 until 1937. It has another recession here and really doesn't fully recover from the Depression till the very end of the decade and the onset of World War II. Okay, this is the big one here this is where I want to dwell a bit on the human dimensions of this great crisis. So in 1932, by the end of 1932, the election of 1932, one might say, the unemployment rate was 25%. That's this up here, 25%. 13 million people unemployed. For the entire decade of the 1930s, the unemployment rate never went below 14%. That's this point right here, 1937. And for the decade as a whole, if you average this out, for the decade as a whole, unemployment was 14%. For 10 years, the unemployment rate averaged 14%. Now, even that, the highest unemployment rate we got in the Great Recession was a little over 10%, and we've steadily chipped that down to 5% now. And in fact, it came down pretty rapidly in 2009, 2010. So again, on this dimension as well, no comparison. Moreover, these raw numbers, 25% unemployment rate in 1932 and maximum roughly 10% unemployment rate in 2009, mask or simply don't reveal another very important characteristic of the labor force that it takes a little additional historical knowledge to understand, and to understand why this unemployment rate was catastrophic. And it has to do with the demography of the workforce. In 1930, only about 1 of every 4 women worked for wages. They were mostly young women, most of whom intended to and did indeed leave the labor force by the time they married in their 20s. Whereas in our own time now, a majority of women work for wages. Even more pertinent is the number of married women who are working, 12% in 1930. In our time, it's well over 60%. So it means when we go back here and look at this 25% unemployment rate, for all practical purposes, we're talking about nearly 25% of all households that suddenly were without wage income. If, God forbid, we had a 25% unemployment rate today, it would not be this catastrophic because the typical American household today has 2 wage earners in it. So 25% unemployment rate measured against the size of the labor force is one thing, measured against the number of households when the typical household had a single wage earner in it is a very different matter altogether. So the demography of the workforce is something we need to remember when we try to get our heads around the degree of misery and calamity that we associate with these unemployment figures in the 1930s. This is I'm particularly fond, if that's the right word, of this particular photograph of a Hooverville, as they were called, these shanty towns where unemployed workers went to do the best they could, because this one was taken in my hometown of Seattle in 1934, 7 years before I was born. Now, that's another fact that's going to come into play here in just a little bit. But these are just some different ways to try to get our heads around what exactly was the human toll, the human impact of this calamitous economic event. I'm not in the habit of quoting Joseph Stalin, but I'm going to quote him here just once. Because Joseph Stalin once said that to kill millions is to create a statistic, but to murder one man is to inflict a tragedy. And I often think of that when I try to make my students who've grown up in this virtually uninterruptedly secure, prosperous, affluent era that we've enjoyed with the single brief interruption of the Great Recession now for decades. I try to make them understand what's going on here. So let me try to reduce this or translate this into terms that my students at least find easier to comprehend than just numbers about 13 million people and 25% unemployed and so on. So I asked them to imagine Stanford football stadium, which in 1930 held 85,000 people. We've since downsized it. Don't ask me why, but now it's a smaller stadium. But it was the stadium that was built in the 1920s, and I get special traction on this particular illustration with my students at Stanford because Herbert Hoover gave his acceptance speech accepting the Republican presidential nomination in 1928 in that stadium. And it's where he got off this notorious line about we here in the United States today are nearer to the final conquest over poverty in the history of the human race. Words that he had to eat without salt just a few years later. So Stanford Stadium has a special resonance for me and my students there. But here you have to try to imagine now a stadium with 85,000 seats in it. And let's say it's January 1st, the first Saturday of January in 1930. 85,000 people are invited to a sporting event in the Stanford Stadium. The condition of entrance to receive an invitation is you must be a head of household. So the crowd is overwhelmingly male. There are some women, but it's overwhelmingly male. They enjoy the spectacle in front of them, watch the game, whatever it is that they're looking at. And at the end of the event, an announcement comes over the public address system, and it says, every single one of you in this stadium has just lost his job or her job. And as they file out in a state of shock about this great surprise, 1 out of every 4 of them is given a piece of paper that says, and you will not have any secure wage income for at least the next 4 years. The next Saturday, the event is repeated. 85,000 heads of household are invited to Stanford Stadium. They watch the event. The address comes over the PA system. Every single one of you has just lost your employment. And as they file out, 1 out of every 4 is given a piece of paper saying no wage income for the next 4 years. That event is repeated every Saturday in January, February, and indeed every single Saturday in 1930. Every Saturday without interruption in 1931. Every Saturday in 1932. And every Saturday until roughly the 1st of March, 1933. March 4th, 1933 is Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. You can do the math. It takes 153 weeks, Saturdays, at 85,000 a clip to get to the total of 13 million people unemployed by the time of Roosevelt's inauguration in March of 1933. Now, clearly this is just a thinking exercise. It's a way to visualize and comprehend the scale of this unemployment phenomenon. But the numbers I've just given you, again, just a thinking exercise, they're utterly faithful to the scale and to the speed with which this unemployment crisis came on. Within roughly a 3.5 year period, 13 million, essentially all of them heads of household, went without wages and were unemployed, and many of them were unemployed for not just a few weeks or months or even a year, but for up to 4 years and even more. Now, there are statistical or numeric ways we can try to capture the human damage that this crisis caused. Here's one. Here's the marriage rate goes down rather precipitously and doesn't really get back until the very end of the decade. That's the marriage rate. The divorce rate also goes down. We might have our own opinions about that, but we think that divorce, especially in that era, was a function of women's employment opportunities, and there weren't many, so the divorce rate goes down. And perhaps most interestingly, the birth rate goes down. From 1928 down to this point, and never recovers until the end of the decade. This is the demographic backdrop to the baby boom of the war and post-war period. There's a birth dearth in the 1930s, and part of the baby boom that we're all familiar with, and indeed many people in this room are baby boomers, I presume, part of your karmic destiny of when you're going to be born has to do with the effects of this birth dearth in the 1930s. Now, among the people who were going unborn in this birth dearth period was your speaker this evening. And again, I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. All right, so these are just ways to try to get our heads around just how much human suffering this was. And I'm going to put a few more images up here, just by way of reminding us of the human face of this crisis. There's all kinds of ways to, these are people exiting your neighboring state of Kansas. And here's a homestead in Missouri, right here. And the artist, John Langley Howard, painted several of these paintings. The expressions on the faces of the people in them, I think, really capture quite movingly what the emotional impact of this must have been. All right. So, how did the American people, how did individuals who were affected by this matter, how did they respond to it? One of the pieces of evidence about this that I find most intriguing is a passage in a memoir by one of Franklin Roosevelt's closest advisors, Rexford Tugwell, an economist who was a member of the so-called Brains Trust that advised Roosevelt in the 32 campaign, and many of them then went to work in the Roosevelt administration. And many of them, most of them in fact, wrote really excellent memoirs about their experience in the Depression, New Deal period of history. And in Tugwell's memoir, which to repeat is called simply The Brains Trust, you find this passage. He's describing traveling with Franklin Roosevelt during the 1932 presidential campaign. They're traveling mostly by train around the country, and Roosevelt is campaigning, and Tugwell is describing the kinds of conversations they had, that is, the advisors, with candidate Roosevelt. And in this passage, he's paraphrasing Roosevelt, not quoting him exactly, But here is his paraphrase of a subject that Roosevelt returned to many times. He said, "There had never been a time, the Civil War alone excepted," said Roosevelt, "when our institutions had been in such jeopardy." Repeatedly, he spoke of this, saying that it was enormously puzzling to him that the ordeal of the past 3 years had been endured so peaceably. Now, the word that jumped off the page at me when I read that was peaceably. And that's a puzzle. It was a puzzle to Roosevelt in 1932. It was a puzzle to many other observers at that time. It's been a puzzle with historians ever since, is why the American people, especially in the front end of the Depression, the worst phase of it, 1930, 31, 32, why they were so passive and docile and peaceable, to use Roosevelt's word, in the face of this great catastrophe. Many people tried to think this through at the time. Historians have tried to think through it later. In my mind, the best insight into this question, or the best attempt to answer this question, is a classic study in social psychology by she was then a young social psychologist at the University of Chicago by the name of Mira Komorowski. And she and her research associates canvassed the country in the 1930s, interviewing unemployed people and their families, and trying to come up with some understanding of exactly what emotionally and psychologically was going on. And she wrote a book about it in 1940. It's a classic in the annals of social psychology, the title of which reminds us about something about that demographic profile of the workforce. The title of the book is The Unemployed Man and His Family. And the book is chock-a-block with truly fascinating observations about what unemployment did to authority relationships in the family, what it did to relationships between spouses, between parents and children, children's attitudes toward parents, children's attitudes towards their parents' legitimacy, authority, capacity to provide for them. So you can imagine. But the single most consistent finding that she and her research team found all over the country was that the unemployed man, his core psychological reaction to going unemployed, was to feel ashamed and guilty and mortified, to feel personally responsible for the predicament that he and his family were in. So shame, guilt, mortification, embarrassment, humiliation. These are the emotions that she found consistently around the fact of unemployment. Now, if we could teleport ourselves back to the 1930s and interview some of those same people that Mira Komorowski and her team interviewed, and they told us how guilty and ashamed they felt that they were unemployed, we might be inclined to say, well, hey, buddy, take it easy. Look around here. There's 12,999,999 other unemployed people. It's not your individual fault. It's not your moral failing. The whole system has collapsed, and it has affected millions of your countrymen, and it's not just you. And we might think, at least I would think, that would be a perfectly rational and reasonable way to have the conversation about what had gone wrong in the 1930s. It wasn't as if 13 million people suddenly, their moral fiber evaporated and they all became unworthy citizens, and they deserved to be punished by unemployment. It was a systemic breakdown. But that's not the way the American people reacted. Now, later in the Depression, there are very loud public protests, collective citizen protests, most famously in the sit-down strikes in the automobile districts in 1936-37. But in the onset of the Depression, for several years in a row, what was remarkable, what lots of people tried to understand, was why the American people were so docile, so passive, so unexpressive politically about their predicament. So it seems to me that this Mira Komorowski's explanation rings true to me as the best answer we have about trying to explain this, what we might think of as odd behavior. And it makes sense to me, not least of all because of my own family history, and now at last I'll tell you why I wouldn't be here if the Depression hadn't happened. My parents were married in August of 1930. And they went on a honeymoon. They were married in Washington State, and they went on a honeymoon to Alaska. My father at that time was working in a copper mining camp in the North Cascade Range of Washington State, in a place called Trinity. It's still on many maps. It's maybe 40 miles northwest of a little town called Leavenworth, if any of you have any familiarity with that geography at all. It was then, it still is to a degree, but it was then an extremely remote, isolated place in the winter. The winters were severe, as in 30 to 40 feet of accumulated snowfall. So the women in this camp all would leave in the wintertime, the women and the miners, and go live in Seattle or Spokane, essentially, and come back only in the spring. And the winter season lasted essentially from October till May. So my parents went on their honeymoon. They came back, and they saw, the good news was that the company had built a 2-room annex on one of the administrative buildings so that my mother could stay through the winter. She was going to be the first woman ever to stay in the camp. She'd grown up in the Canadian Rockies in a coal mining district, and she was used to ferocious winters, so it didn't bother her to be isolated in the snow and the cold all this time. So they built a 2-room annex. That was going to be where they were going to live. That was the good news. The bad news was that in the month or so they'd been away, the company had gone bankrupt because the Depression was coming on and copper prices were plummeting and the place just couldn't stay in production. For reasons that to this day are largely mysterious to me, I don't fully understand even now exactly what went on, but they stayed there for 6 years. And by about the 3rd or 4th year, they were the only people there. They were 2 people in this very isolated mining camp, and it essentially became a ghost town. Everybody else left. And I don't know how my father kept the wolf from the door or put bread on the table. It's a complete mystery. He would never talk about it. My mother, very late in life, after my father had passed actually, told me that when it became clear after that first winter, and we went out and looked for jobs in the spring following, when he could find nothing, and he came back in utter despair, and he shed a whole layer of skin like a molting snake because he had some kind of nervous breakdown. And to repeat, they stayed there for 6 years. He finally got his first labor job working in the grocery store at the construction site for Grand Coulee Dam, a public works administration project in eastern Washington. So my father clearly, seems to me, conforms very precisely to the profile that Mira Komorowski gave us in 1940. He thought he'd let himself down, let his new bride down, and so on. And it's why I'm now presenting myself to you as a historical specimen from the 1930s. I call myself a child of the Depression, even though I was born in 1941, which is the year when we customarily think the Depression ended. Because absent the Depression, my parents, good Irish Catholics that they were, almost certainly would have started to procreate about a decade earlier than they did. Instead, for the best of my knowledge, they were copulating prophylactically up there in the wageless snows of Washington, and I went unborn for 10 years or more. And it's also the case that when I came along, my mother was nearly 40 years old by that time, and there were no more little Kennedys. It's not only why I was born when I was, but why I'm an only child. So in the very geometry, demography, character, historical identity of my family, I'm a product of the Depression. I just offer myself to you as that kind of historical object. Now, if that weren't enough to kind of convince me that Mira Komorowski was onto something, I'll share another story with you. I was talking about this very subject at the Newberry Library, another great municipal library in Chicago a few years ago. And at the end of my remarks, I was in the lobby outside the lecture hall, and a man came up to me, a man I would guess, I'm just guessing, in his 80s, I suppose. And he said, you know, your remarks in there made me think of something I hadn't thought of for a long, long time. He said, my father, when I was a little boy here in Chicago, and I was whatever he was, 6, 7, 8 years old, he said he came home one day and he went upstairs to his bedroom and he closed the door, and we kids never saw him again for 2 years. He stayed in that room for 2 years. My mother took him his meals. He wouldn't come downstairs, never out of the house. He just made a hermit out of himself right in our home. for 2 years. He said, as a kid, he said, I didn't know what was going on. He said, my mother later told me what was going on. So the story here parallels mine to a certain extent. He said, my father had a small insurance brokerage business in Chicago, and the Depression came, and the business went bust, and he went unemployed. And he spent weeks or months or whatever, a long time, looking for other employment, and he couldn't find anything. And one day, in desperation, he got himself into a line where some local charity or church was giving unemployed people bags of groceries to take back to their homes. And he got in this line, last resort kind of thing, and he was waiting to get his bag of groceries, and one of his former customers came by and saw him. And he was so mortified and humiliated at that he left the line, didn't even get the bag of groceries, came home, shut himself up in the room for 2 years. And at this point, when this old gentleman was telling me the story, he started to sob. And I mean, not just a tear or two, but he was shaking. And he walked away. That's the last I heard of him or from him. And I thought, boy, you know, here we are, whatever we are, 60, 70 years on, and the memory of that event and that moment in this man's life can still reduce a grown man to tears, as the fabled expression goes. So this is an event of tremendous human, deep human consequence, quite apart from the usual statistics that we usually try to force upon our students. Okay, so what's going on here? My touchstone for a further explanation of all this, and here we enter into this territory about how the Depression reveals some things about our enduring political culture in our society, goes back to this guy, Alexis de Tocqueville. This portrait was done in 1850, apparently, but it shows Tocqueville as a much younger man. You might know that Tocqueville came to the United States in the era of Andrew Jackson. He spent about 9 months traveling around the country. He went home to France, and he wrote what to this day remains the most penetrating and insightful book ever written about the essential nature of American society and politics. It's called simply Democracy in America. It's 2 volumes. The first volume is a little bit boring. It's all about institutions. Second volume is about what we might, generally speaking, call the national character. What was different about America? What made it a distinctive society? If any of you have not yet read Tocqueville, I cannot recommend it too strongly. It's to repeat, in my view, not just my view either, it's the single best thing ever written about what makes this society distinctive. And in that book, Democracy in America, Tocqueville coined a term. He invented a new word. It's entered our vocabulary. We use it all the time. It's common to us. But it was new in his time, and the word is individualism. And if you read the relevant passages, Tocqueville distinguishes individualism from selfishness or egotism. He says those are just constants of human nature everywhere. But in America, there's another layer of this kind of thing. Yes, there's egotism. Yes, there's selfishness. But there's something else, which he had never seen before, never read about, didn't know from his studies, never observed, and he called it individualism. And it was the idea that every citizen is an empire unto himself, fully self-sufficient, fully able to take on the world and take it by the horns. And this is a psychology, a worldview, an outlook that Tocqueville observed, and many people have agreed with him ever since, has tremendously energized this society. It has motivated all kinds of people to undertake daring tasks and to improve their lot in life. And it's a great trait of our national character over 2 centuries and more. But as the Depression revealed, this individualistic philosophy or psychology also had a dark underside, because if it's true, as so many of us believe, and as we've learned at our mother's knee, that we are the captains of our own destiny and the masters of our own fate, and the world is our oyster, it's also true if we fail, our first recourse is to think it's my fault. It's not the system's fault. It's not the structural fault. It's not an institutional fault. It's not the leadership's fault. It's my fault. And this is the dark underside, it seems to me, of the very positive energies that the psychology of individualism has imparted to our society, but there is this other side to it. Okay, let me say just a few other things by way of coming to a conclusion here about some of the political implications of this crisis. So I've called it a crisis. It was an economic crisis. It was a political crisis, an institutional crisis, as Roosevelt said. It was also a crisis of values and culture, even, you might say, a crisis of national identity. Now, I'm told, I don't speak Chinese or read it, but I'm told that in Chinese, the character for crisis is a fusion of the ideograms for danger and opportunity. Danger plus opportunity equals crisis. And whether that's literally true of the Chinese language, I do think this is a quite legitimate way to think about what politically was going on when the Great Depression came over the horizon. And this is where the role of leadership, I think, really starts to come into focus. Like almost all professional historians, I am extremely wary of anything that used to be called, that looks like what used to be called the great man theory of history, that history is all about big personalities who shaped the terms of life for all the rest of us. It's just, we're trained, that's trained out of us in graduate school to think that way. But I submit to you that it's pretty difficult to think of this period in American history without making reference to the personality of Franklin Roosevelt. And I think, again, I think it's not too much to say that in this crisis, he was a visionary. And he had a vision that this crisis gave him the opportunity to advance. So, and the opportunity was, and he put it this way several times in his language, I'm quoting him now, is to reduce the hazards and vicissitudes of life for every single American, to make life less risky, more predictable, more stable, to enable people to plan for futures, to uncouple them from all the gyrations of the equity markets and the unemployment markets and so on, to introduce elements of stability and security into their lives of the kind that the patrician Roosevelt family had already enjoyed for centuries. And I do think that's a lot of what the New Deal did. It introduced changes to American institutions. Again, you can read more about it in Freedom from Fear in detail. I'm going to give you the Cliff Note executive summary here. It's not an excuse for not reading the book. But if you go through the major institutional reforms from the New Deal period that lasted, not the things that were had a shelf life of less than a decade, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, and so on. Emergency measures that didn't last beyond World War II. But the things that lasted, which were at the core of Roosevelt's program, the Social Security Act, note the word security, the Securities Exchange Act, which stabilized stock markets, so we've not had a stock market collapse anything resembling the one we had in the 1920s and 30s ever since. Federal Housing Authority, which supplemented by the Veterans Administration housing programs, which essentially provided the capital to the mortgage lending industry and the construction industry to build the Sun Belt after World War II. I could go on with a list of other things from the New Deal era that created an institutional landscape that was new and introduced terms of security, stability, predictability into American life in sector after sector, economic sectors, employment sector, and so on and so forth. So just hypothetically, things like Social Security Act, Wagner Labor Relations Act, I should have mentioned a moment ago, Federal Housing Authority, Fair Labor Standards Act, which abolished child labor and set minimum wages. You could go on with a whole list of these things. Hypothetically, if we asked ourselves, what if the New Deal, another what if question, had in 1933, in the fabled and colorful 100 Days, an historical episode, in my view, which has been hugely exaggerated in its importance over the years. But what if then, in that 100 days in the spring of 1933, the Roosevelt administration had found the key that unlocked the mystery of the Great Depression and restored the economy to full health by the end of that calendar year? Would there have been a New Deal as we know it? I think the answer is resoundingly no. All the things I've just mentioned, Social Security Act, Federal Housing Authority, Securities and Exchange Commission, Fair Labor Standards Act, all date from 1934 and after. So there's a relationship here that I think Roosevelt's champions have long been a little wary about exploring, but a relationship between the persistence of the crisis through the whole decade of the 30s and the long-term political and institutional consequences that came out of it. Now, what I'm arguing in effect here is that it may well be that Roosevelt's priority on taking office was not ending the Depression as quickly as possible. His priority was to use the crisis to shape these new institutional structures that would stabilize and prosper American society in the future, and he understood that the moment of opportunity wouldn't last forever. Now, I have something that approaches a smoking gun piece of evidence for this. It's not maybe quite as good as I might like, but it's something. And it comes out of a speech you can easily get online, read it for yourselves if you don't take my word for it. It's Roosevelt's second inaugural address in January of 1937. Now, if you remember, you probably don't, but if you remember the graph that was up there, 1937 was a fairly prosperous year. It looked like the Depression was ending. Unemployment was up to about, it was at 14%. It had been 25% just 4 years earlier. Of course, we get that second dip in the late 1930s, but 1937, things were looking pretty good. So Roosevelt gives this inaugural address, January of 1937, and as you might expect, he crows in the first several paragraphs about how successful he has been in damping down, if not fully conquering, but certainly reducing the impact of the Depression. So he says, I'm quoting him now, I've got my text here in front of me. He said, our progress out of the Depression is obvious. Okay? And then he goes on to detail just exactly how much progress there's been. He said, we have come far from the days of stagnation and despair. Vitality has been preserved. Courage and confidence have been restored. Mental and moral horizons have been extended. And then comes a sentence that I think is just a shocker, and I defy anybody to find anything comparable to this sentence in any presidential utterance from George Washington through Barack Obama. Because then he says, but such symptoms of prosperity may become portents of disaster. And in fact, in the printed text, there's an exclamation point at the end of that sentence. And then he goes on to utter one of his most famous pronouncements that still lives in our folklore, when he said, I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, and he itemizes the ways in which he thinks 1/3 of the American people are living substandard lives. Now, casual students of the Depression era, when they hear that 1/3 of a nation phrase, think, reasonably enough, well, he was talking about the unemployed, the people who were immiserated by the Depression itself. If you read this address, you understand that's not what he's talking about at all. He thinks the Depression is ending. He thinks we're on the track out of the Depression altogether. And then he says, but we still have 1/3 of our fellow citizens in a state of immiseration, and the problem is not yet solved. And we have to carry on. And if the crisis ends too soon, he seems to be saying, we're going to lose the chance. And in fact, there is very little New Deal legislation of any kind after 1937, so he had something right. All right, one last point, come back to this comparison between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. In 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, there was a lot of, let me just briefly add this to address another piece of mythology about the New Deal. These are the deficits the New Deal ran, and here are the deficits in World War II. The New Deal ran deficits, to be sure, but they're dwarfed by the deficits in the war itself. So Roosevelt was actually, at the end of the day, something of a fiscal conservative. He didn't like debt, and he tried, in fact, he vetoed the so-called bonus bill, the Veterans Bonus Bill, in 1936, passed over his veto because he thought it would add too much to the debt, and he was right. And again, federal budget deficits as percentage of GDP, 5% in the New Deal era, wartime 27, 22%, and today roughly in the 8-9% range. These are annual deficits as a percentage of GDP. So again, a lot of mythology about the New Deal as a big spending proposition. It's really quite exaggerated. Okay, but back to a comparison between, well, again, bank failures. This actually should have been up there earlier, but okay. Back to a comparison between the Great Depression and Great Recession. When President Obama was elected in 2008, the punditocracy, the commentariat, was full of observations that this was another New Deal-ish moment, that he had the capacity and the intention and the situation and the circumstance to be another Franklin Roosevelt. Like Roosevelt, he was a Democrat, and he was aspirationally transformative in his agenda. He came to power, as Roosevelt did, in the midst of a severe economic crisis. And he followed a badly discredited conservative administration, Hoover in Roosevelt's case, and G.W. Bush in Obama's case. And both of them understood, so the observations went at that time, that a crisis also presented opportunities. You might remember Rahm Emanuel, now the mayor of Chicago, Obama's first chief of staff, one of his closest advisors at that time, gave an interview where Emanuel said in November of 2008, just after the election, he said, "You never want a crisis to go to waste." There's the psychology, exactly the psychology of seeing opportunity as well as danger. President Obama, after 1 month in office, was on what was then called the Lehrer News Hour on the PBS. Lehrer is no longer there, but you know what I'm talking about, the PBS News Hour. And he was interviewed by Jim Lehrer. And Lehrer went through this litany of things that were happening in the world. This is February of 2009. Banks were failing, insurance companies failing, the auto companies were failing. The whole world financial system had frozen, and unemployment numbers were spiking, so on and so forth. Stock market's tanking. He went through all of this, and then he said, Lehrer put the question to Obama, he said, "Do you feel burdened by that full plate?" And Obama replied as follows, I'm quoting him. He said, "I think that we are at an extraordinary moment that is full of peril, but also full of possibility. And I think that's the time you want to be president. I think there's something about this country where hard times, big challenges bring about the best in us. This is when the political system starts to move effectively." Now, it's a subject for some reflection, I think. Why we need crises of these magnitudes in order to make our political system work effectively. The instances of major institutional reform and up-to-dating and modification in our 200-plus year history are all associated with crises, not least of all the crisis of the Great Depression, and to a certain extent, although much lesser level of accomplishment, in the early years of the Obama administration and the crisis of the Great Recession. When people ask, well, why didn't the Obama administration deliver on the promise or expectation or hope that a lot of people had, that it would be another New Deal, a wholesale restructuring of the American landscape? The answer, I think, is simple, because the crisis of the Great Depression was too shallow and didn't last long enough. If it had been deeper and longer the way the Great Depression was, you might have seen more change. And why was the crisis of the Great Recession shorter and not as severe? Because people like Ben Bernanke at the Federal Reserve and Hank Paulson in the Bush administration knew the history of the Great Depression, and they knew that if they didn't counterpunch quickly, the situation could become truly catastrophic. So both the outgoing Bush and the incoming Obama administrations took measures in the banking system and through stimulus spending and so on to arrest the downfall of the economy before it got completely out of control. And ironically, the fact that they refloated the economy in a hurry closed the window of opportunity for further political reform. So you can't be a student of history for very long without coming to a deep appreciation of the role of irony in human life, and this is one irony that I leave you with this evening. I'm happy to take questions and comments. Thank you. As I guess you're all practiced at this, please, if you have a question or a comment,
thank you, sir.
Please come to the microphone. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. My question is, could you talk a little bit about the lean list program that Roosevelt was taking advantage of in order to bring us out of the Depression?
I missed a word. The what program?
The lean list program coming up to World War II.
Lend-Lease. Oh, sorry. Oh, Lend-Lease program. Well, let me make two observations about that. One's directly responsive to your question, so I'll say that one first. The record is absolutely clear. There's no argument about it that the New Deal, the Roosevelt first two administrations did not end the Depression. World War II ended the Depression for a reason that was up here on the screen. Even the screen's gone now. That deficit spending, borrowing to stimulate war production was massive compared to anything that happened during the New Deal itself. So there's just no question whatsoever that it was war spending, especially deficit spending, that refloated the economy. Now, just one footnote or specific matter about the Lend-Lease Act. Actually, since you've given me the opportunity, I'm going to say two things about it. Lend-Lease Act passes in March of 1941. It's customary to think of the end of the isolationist era with the Pearl Harbor attack. I think that's not right. I think the fact that Roosevelt convinced the Congress to pass a $7 billion appropriation in March of 1941 meant that he had already won the argument with the isolationists, and the Congress and the country were, by that date, already ready to put America's weight in the scales against fascism, Nazism, and Japanese militarism. So the country had really substantially got itself aligned with his foreign policies well before Pearl Harbor, I believe. Secondly, just a quick empirical fact about it, the initial Lend-Lease appropriation, eventually it's a $50 billion program, but the initial appropriation was $7 billion. Only one New Deal budget, entire budget in the 1930s, only one budget was larger than $7 billion, and it was like 7.1 or 7.2 billion, and that was because of the bonus bill that passed over Roosevelt's veto. So the Lend-Lease Act, taken in singularity, was greater than the entirety of federal spending in any given year throughout the 1930s. I mean, again, it's just a way to get our heads around just how massive a commitment that was. Adolf Hitler said when he heard the news that the Lend-Lease Act had passed, which provided for American material and financial support to the British and later the Russians, he said, "This is tantamount to a declaration of war." And he was right. Yes, sir.
This has been an awesome presentation. As a child of Europe, born in the 40s, I've always been amazed by the fact that America did not take the turn into the despair of totalitarianism that all of Europe did. And I've always been wondering why that would be, and you point the finger towards individualism. Now we have a relatively minor crisis that's been going on for 6-7 years. It's been splendidly resolved, yet our civil discourse seems to have fallen completely apart. Do you believe that there's lack of individualism? Do we have lost our directional sense? Do you have a comment on this here?
That's a big, ambitious question. I'm going to give a less ambitious answer. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to actually not say much about the present day, but I can say a little something about the historical period that I know more about. Tell me if this is a fair paraphrase of your question about why was the United States, as the great crisis of World War II was building toward the formal war itself, 1939, why was this country so persistently and stubbornly isolationist? Is that a fair? Okay, a little different question. Why or how did this country retain its basic constitutional, institutional structure even in the midst of this crisis? A point worth underlining here, and thank you for the question, is that in the midst of this crisis, through this crisis, I should say, and through the crisis of war, which followed immediately after, we did not change the constitutional structure of the country at all. In the Civil War era, we amended the Constitution 3 times in the space of about a decade in order to try to nail down ever more securely the rights and privileges of freed African Americans. Nothing comparable happened at the constitutional level in the crises of the Depression and World War II. So there is a remarkable stability to the American constitutional system through the entire 20th century, essentially. Whether it's going to stay that way, that's the future. And we don't have any data from the future, and historians certainly don't see into the future any more than anybody else does. But let me go back to what I thought was your question at first. About isolationism, why the United States stood aloof from the gathering storm, as Winston Churchill called it, around the globe through the 1930s. It's my belief, and I try to argue this case in the book, that Franklin Roosevelt, along with Winston Churchill, saw the dangers that were growing in the 1930s earlier than most people. In Roosevelt's case, I think at least as early as 1935, when the Italians invaded what was then called Abyssinia, Ethiopia. And he began a campaign, let's call it, to try to educate the American people to the role that the United States might play in this crisis and how it might help avert a true catastrophic calamity, which eventually happens, of course. It takes him about 5 or 6 years to bring public opinion around. It was a long, sustained effort from 1935 down to, I think, the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. So why was that so hard? Well, 2 reasons, one deep background, one more historically relevant. The country had been isolationist since the 18th century, since its founding. It had no hostile neighbors on its borders. It had 2 big oceans that protected it from anybody that had bad intentions. And it had no real felt need to be anything other than isolationist. That's the bigger background. And when there had been a rather significant departure from isolationist policy in 1917, when the United States entered World War I, under the banner of making the world safe for democracy, instead of getting Europe reformed and redeemed and democratized, we got Bolshevism in Russia and fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. And the American people were deeply disillusioned by that World War I era departure from historic practice. World War I was to that era, you might say, something comparable to what Vietnam was to a later era, the mistake never to be repeated. And the bloody Europeans could hack themselves to death and we didn't have a dog in the fight. I mean, that was the attitude. So if you take all those historical factors into account, then it's a little more understandable why Roosevelt has such a task on his hands to convince people of something otherwise. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. If you look at military conflict, you can quantify casualty rates. You can tell how many people killed in World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, whatever. Has there ever been any social science data done on casualty rates of economic collapse? Your expertise is a Great Depression, so I'll throw that out there. Has there been any good, solid social science data done on how many people, and I'll put it like this, were killed by the Depression?
I'm not going to give you a very satisfactory answer because I believe there are some isolated monographic studies, usually in localities. But to the best of my knowledge, at least off the top of my head, I don't think I've ever seen a truly comprehensive study of that. It'd be a very difficult thing definitionally to ascribe such and such a death to economic privation or whatever. But conceptually, it's a very interesting idea. So maybe I can get a graduate student to go to work on it.
There you go. Okay, so I'll wrap up with this. If you were forced to, and it's obviously tough, it's much harder than a military casualty list, that's obvious. But if you were forced to say, you've studied this, just your own opinion, not backed up by any data, if you had to guess, how many people you think died from the Depression as a direct result?
I have no way to answer that.
Can't do it. Just can't do it.
I've taken too serious a pledge to empirical reality to be able even to answer.
Can't do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
A few years ago, conservative economist Amity Shlaes published a book, and one of our arguments was that the New Deal actually made the Depression worse, not better. And I just wonder if you could take on that argument or offer your
It's a
comments
terrible
on it.
book. It's conceptually, I think, really off the mark for a reason I'll specify in just a minute. And her data have been challenged very, very sharply by people who have studied the matter more closely than she has. The book is yet another of the perpetual use of the New Deal as a kind of marker for big government, irresponsible spending, intrusive nanny state, blah, blah, blah. Any close reading of what the New Deal actually did will convince me anyway, that is a huge exaggeration of the way the New Deal went about what it did do. But it's lingered and persisted in our political culture as a kind of a talisman with which people talk about the historical basis of of big government. One last comment about that. Among the reasons why I think that book is so fundamentally mistaken is because it understands, or tries to understand, tries to argue, that the Great Depression was an American phenomenon, had its causes in this country, and all the remedies were in this country. The Great Depression was a global phenomenon. It affected the entire world economy. And any discussion of the New Deal, or pardon me, of the Great Depression, that doesn't acknowledge at the outset that this is a global phenomenon is just going to go off on the wrong path. So my handlers are starting to get a little restless here in the wings, so how about we take 2 more questions, one here and one there. Yes, sir.
How important was machine politics, like the Pendergast era, during the time of the Roosevelt administration and coming out of the Depression? And we know that Truman was connected to Roosevelt, but he wasn't informed about much of the things that was going on. But again, we have a great era of machine politics during the Depression.
Yes, you certainly do, and I'm sure there are many people in this room, including yourself, sir, who know more about that than I do. So I'm not going to embarrass myself by talking about a subject in which there's more expertise in the room than there is on the stage. But suffice it to say that Roosevelt was, all his life, nothing other than a politician. That was his life's calling, his vocation, his identity. And he understood machine politics as well as other kinds of politics. And though as governor of New York, he got himself crosswise with the Tammany machine a bit, but once in office, he knew how to work the levers of power. And if that meant working with machines here and there and elsewhere, he'd do it if it could be to his advantage, including yours. Okay, last round. Is it a joint question? It is. Okay, all right.
So this is in relation to the unemployed man and his family. It's kind of a what if, I suppose. If this study was conducted during the Great Recession, do you think it would have similar results?
You know, in fact, there were attempts, at least, at similar studies in the Great Recession. I can't give you a chapter and verse, but I know people went out and tried to figure those kinds of things out. But again, the big difference between then and now, well, among the big differences, is unemployment in the Great Recession didn't last for a decade. And secondly, it was, most households had a backup wage earner. So it wasn't as if, talk about a 10% unemployment rate in 2009, it wasn't 10% of all households. Talk about a 25% unemployment rate in 1932-33, you're effectively talking about a 22 or 3% of all households. So it's much more massive economic destruction in that era. But the short answer is yes, there are studies. Again, I can't quote them to you, but if you Google, you'll probably find some things.
Well, I guess the question was more in relation to like the feelings of guilt.
The sense of shame?
Yes, in the few studies I've looked at, there is some of that guilt and shame and assumption of personal responsibility. But again, just impressionistically, I would say less so. And I think, this is just my opinion, that as a society, our schedule of values has shifted a bit from the 1930s. And again, I give the evidence I would adduce here is that the outgoing Bush administration also understood, as well as the incoming Obama administration, that government had a role to play. And indeed, it was incumbent upon the institutions and instrumentalities of government to counterpunch to this crisis. That was not thought to be legitimate or proper government function. That's what got Herbert Hoover all tied in a knot. And it took a real kind of a break and a change in national psychology to get over that hump. So I think we now have a set of expectations about what government's supposed to do when we get into a real economic mess that wasn't nearly as well articulated 70 or 80 years ago. So thank you all very much.